you will see in my talk, different from Trichette's yesterday, where she divided it into basically the kind of research she does and then her life history. I'm going to weave a particular research problem, one that I started with my thesis, through my life history, because it didn't get solved in my thesis. And so what I would like to share with you is some things particularly that my grandmother shared with me. She was one of the most special people in the world to me. She never graduated from high school. She married my grandfather, and my grandfather was meat man in a local market with my grandmother's father. And she did all kinds of things. She took in boarders to make enough money so that their children, my mother and my aunt, could go to college. She cleaned the Episcopal Church, after every Sunday service and everything else. So she was a person who said, if I want something, I work hard to do it. And you'll see that theme through this particular talk that I will give. The most interesting piece of my grandmother, in a way, is she lived to be 92. And in her 80s, she wrote poetry. So as a tribute to her, unfortunately, just after she died, I published her book of poems. So here's a woman who never went to finished high school, never went to college, who could write amazing poetry. And so, again, that emphasizes this theme of my talk today. You can do anything you put your mind to, which is what the title of the talk actually is. And that means it can be mathematics, it means it can be sending your kids to an expensive college. It can mean writing poetry. It just requires doing it. So, okay, this doesn't seem to, there it goes. So, again, I'm emphasizing this theme of being able to do anything you put your mind to, as well as life is not a continuous path. You can't take the number line and plot it on the number line usually. When I was in 3rd grade, I told Sister Ann Peter, my teacher, that I wanted to teach arithmetic when I grew up. And she said, you can't just teach arithmetic in 3rd grade, you have to teach everything. But she said, if you want to do that, make sure you do it. And so by the time I got to high school, I decided I would teach math in high school. That way I only had to teach math. I didn't have to teach everything else. But in high school I had already determined I wanted to teach. I wasn't even sure what it was, except my senior year in high school, Mr. Dunlap, the math teacher I had, ended up in the hospital for a few weeks, and they said, we don't have a substitute who knows math. Midge, will you teach? So they gave me 3 weeks off from my other courses, and I taught math at that point. And it embedded in me the need, the desire, the passion, whatever I wanted to teach. So, okay, you go to college. I went to the University of Rochester. And Rochester didn't have a secondary education major or anything, but there was an amazing professor, Dr. Norman Gunderson, and he somehow had agreed with the university that he would help people get certification in secondary math who wanted it. And so he did. He taught the course in secondary methods. Even though he was a mathematician, he made it possible for people to graduate from the University of Rochester and to be able to teach math. So I taught math as part of my student teaching at Greece Olympia High School, a suburb of Rochester. And during that particular time, I loved teaching high school math. And so they gave me a job the next year, and I stayed in the Rochester area, and I taught high school math. Midway through the second semester, I get a phone call from the State University of New York at Geneseo. and said, we need a math instructor. Will you come and teach for us at the college? And I said, but I don't even have a master's degree. I said, how am I supposed to do that? And they said, we know you're a really good teacher. You'll be good at teaching at the college level. And then they made a statement which, they probably roll over in their graves if they hear me say it. They said that a bachelor's degree in math from Rochester was better than a master's degree from one of their state schools. And so that they were perfectly happy to have me teach 4 courses a semester. Nowadays, the faculty members, I was talking to a couple yesterday, said, 4? Now it's 2 and 2. I said, no, it was 4 and 4 at that point. But by the end of my second year at Geneseo, I decided I needed to get an advanced degree, and I wasn't sure whether it was master's or a PhD at that point. But I wanted to teach, and that's where I intended to end up. So that first faculty position is actually at the State University of New York at Geneseo with a bachelor's degree. Well, this thing doesn't always want to change there. So at that particular point, graduate school really did seem out of reach, okay? But I thought I've got to give it a try. So I applied to graduate school. And at that point in time, many universities, like Rutgers at the time, you started out in a master's program and then you were accepted into a PhD program. So you didn't have to commit your life to getting a PhD at that stage. So Rutgers accepted me. A number of other places did, like the University of Michigan and Catholic University. Why did I go to Rutgers? I can say that to this group of women. They had 5 female tenured faculty at Rutgers at that time. They haven't seen that since, but at any rate, at that point, they had 5. And I thought they must understand women as math majors and so forth. So that's why I chose Rutgers. It wasn't true at the other places I applied to. And so that's actually something that you need to look at when you're considering graduate school. When I was at Northeastern University, which you'll see eventually in this segue, we increased the graduate female population dramatically. I also hired 3 or 4 female mathematicians, and I asked them, why did you come to Northeastern? And they said, because if a woman is chair of the department, then women will be treated well. And that isn't 100% true, but do, as you're look at what the makeup of the math department is, particularly in some of these big universities like Rutgers. Because they haven't had, since Amy Cohen retired, they haven't had a tenured woman faculty member for any number of years. And they get some in at the assistant level, and then they leave because they don't have anybody else with them. Okay, so I did go to Rutgers. I spent, you will notice that I never spent a long time in school, continuously. I spent 2 years at Rutgers and ended up with a master's degree. But I had been accepted to the PhD program, and my husband was a PhD student at the time. One of us should get a job, and the other should finish their degree. And mind you, this is a long time ago. This is back in 1965 or 66. And so my husband continued and got his PhD in 1969, and I taught at Rider College. I taught at different places, but primarily at Rider, and ended up as an assistant professor at Rider with a master's degree at that stage. But John, my husband of the time, always had felt guilty that he continued and I didn't. So he kept pressing me once the kids were in school, because we had 2 kids by then, that I should go back. And Rutgers, even 10 years later, I stopped in 67 and went back in 77. And of course, universities have this trick of telling you, oh, you won't be able to take credit for what courses you took if they're more than 6 years old or 7 years old. And Rutgers said 7, but they gave me credit for everything I had taken. So I said, okay, I'll go back and we'll see what happens. And I met Fred Roberts. And anybody here who has ever met Fred Roberts, anybody have met him? Any of this group? Yeah, a couple. If you've ever met Fred Roberts, he is contagious in his enthusiasm to do applied math problems. And so at that point in time, he was doing graph theory, but he was doing all kinds of other applications of mathematics, all discrete math, and he had more problems to solve than you could ever count. And it was infectious, because he said to me, which I say to students today, as an applied mathematician, I find the problem and then discover the mathematics to solve the problem, as opposed to knowing mathematics, like in group theory or something, and pushing more theorems out afterwards. And so consequently, I've worked in many fields. My thesis actually had an ecology part to it, it had a mathematical psychology part to it, and it had a computer science part to it. Well, again, this is one of the tricks Fred pulled, and he still does to this day. My thesis was 310 pages long. My husband's thesis was 12 pages long. My husband's was a non-commutative ring theory, and his advisor said, if you solve this problem, you've got a degree. Well, he solved it in a very few pages. So I have the longest PhD in Rutgers history, and he has the shortest PhD in Rutgers history. But that, he kept saying, well, you like solving problems, here's another problem to solve. So now, mind you, when I did my thesis, there was no computers. It was an IBM Selectric. And I hired somebody to type my thesis, 300 pages worth, and it cost me over $1,000 in those days to get my thesis typed. And she about quit 10 times over because it kept changing along the way. And if you changed a page, you had to really retype everything after that point in time. So, but at any rate, that got me into solving applied problems and really looking at problems that are interesting to solve rather than taking problems that normally would have been posed to you. Okay. So I will talk about one of the problems in ecology that I worked on for my thesis, and that's what I bring up to the current day, basically. But I finished my PhD in 3 years, so I finished in record time, even though I had been out for 10 years. I always felt like I had to make up for lost time. But one of the problems that Fred Roberts had posed to me was a problem initially, and you'll see a slide in a minute, that was posed by Joel Cohen, a mathematical biologist at NYU, around habitat formation and how you can determine the habitat of different species. And he conjectured that you could define the habitat formation based on the dimensions of the habitat space, and you could determine the dimensions graph theoretically from the food webs. And any number of people worked on that problem, and that's the one I worked on as part of my thesis. Everyone's okay. Come on. Okay. And in particular, Joel Cohen's thesis was that you could model predator-prey relationships with food webs, and then you could convert food webs to competition graphs. So in particular, and I'll give you a few slides on that, The food webs describe the direct and indirect interactions between predators and prey. Okay, and in particular, the vertices of the food web are the species that you're talking about. And you create a directed graph, and there's a funny piece of this in a minute I'll share. And of the species in a particular constrained ecosystem, and we'll see examples. I mean, it's not the whole world of species. You've got to have some kind of constraint, geographically usually determined. And there's an arc from Y to X if X preys on Y, because these arcs convey energy transfer. Now, when Fred and Joel Cohen and others were working on this problem, the arcs went the opposite direction. Because if A preys on B, they drew the arcs from A to B. But because the biologists and the ecologists looked at energy transfer, the arc went from B to A. Because if a wolf eats an elk, he's gaining energy from the elk. So, all of a sudden, midstream, they changed the way all the food webs were done. And, of course, it took a little while to get your head around the fact that they were going in the opposite direction. Fred, to this day, won't draw them in that direction. He said, he hasn't worked on that problem in a long time because he won't draw the arcs the other way. So, modeling interactions between predator and prey gives you, as I said, a directed graph, and it's a little hard to see the arrows in this, but for example, there's an arrow from sea otters to sharks, because sharks eat sea otters, and the sharks derive energy from them. So this is an example of a food web. It's just a piece of a food web. It's not a real food web in the sense of, quote, real food webs. This is a real food web. And we'll come back to this one in a little while. And when I talked about the constraint is Yellowstone National Park. The emphasis is on wolves. So you're looking at the interactions of wolves as predators, their prey, their prey and the prey down a level, etc., and those that are competing with wolves for the same prey. So, for example, you see that the bighorn sheep are eaten by wolves, but so are the coyotes, and so are the bison. Okay. So if you're translating that food web, and that is a real, authentic food web, and it lists all the consumables, if you wish, all the possible prey. So it's listing things, like pond lily is listed in the predator-prey relationship. Deer mice are part of the predator-prey relation. Now, deer mice actually are consumed by so many of the species that seems logical. But some of them, it's a very small part of their diet. And as my daughter Barbara, the conservation biologist, says, in some cases they eat things as a matter of convenience. A deer mouse will run past a wolf and he says, "Ooh, I think I better grab that guy." And it's just a tasty appetizer for him till he can find an elk to consume. Okay. So this is a real food web. I mean, it's an actual one that and we will create and show you the competition graph that derives from that particular food web. But Joel Cohen's idea was that the dimensions of the competition graph that were determined by the competition graph, which I'll say a little more about in a few minutes, determines the dimensions of the habitat formation. So, for example, there was a belief that only one dimension determined habitat formation. And if that were the case, then the question is, what is that dimension? Is it temperature? Is it climate more writ large, what kinds of things could be that dominating element that controls basically the predator-prey relations, because remember, we go back to that. Okay. And as I said, Joel Cohen in 1968 was the first person to talk about competition graphs representing food webs. And, whoops, I should go backwards again. So, for example, if you remember the shark food web, which was a simple food web, the competition graph is even smaller because the only two things that compete in that one, okay, were the sea otters and the, can't even read it myself. Somebody needs to read it because it's sideways. Yeah, right. You can read it better than I can at this point. So it's a very small food web. Now, there's one characteristic of a food web that's important as you're developing your competition graphs. Food webs are what are called acyclic. There are no cycles in a food web. So that means you have less problems, if you want to call it that, in the competition graph. But you'd get into cannibalism and things like that if you allowed cycles, and ecologists don't. So the food web, the food web for the wolves in Yellowstone National Park is this. The competition graph is that. So there's a much simpler competition graph than the directed graph or the food web was. And if you look at it, you see that there are very few edges. And this is an important consideration, and actually you can prove theorems, one of which I proved in my thesis actually, that there are a very limited number of edges in any competition graph of any food web. So look at the two green edges and the red edge, because we'll come back to this in a minute, and I want to go backwards to this. They correspond, the green ones as well as the one red edge, they correspond to the red directed edges, or the predator-prey ones, in this particular picture. And as I said, we'll come back to that because it becomes critical to the ultimate solution of the problem. Okay. So if the habitat was one-dimensional, Joel said that would mean that the competition graph was an interval graph. Some of you have probably heard of interval graphs. In other words, you could map the vertices of the competition graph to intervals on the real line, such that there was an edge. If there was an edge between two vertices, then the intervals overlapped on the real line. Now, the discussion of interval graphs goes back even further. And one of the critical, quote, discoverers of interval graphs was Benzer, who was a geneticist. And he used the notion of interval graphs to, quote, look inside genes, to do some of the stuff that the Genome Project actually ended up doing and incorporating in it. There were others in the 50s who talked about interval graphs, but very little was proven in an application setting. So what I just got through saying is if you take a graph, and I skipped the last one, which is okay. If you try to map this graph to intervals, you run into a problem with being able to get the correct correspondence at this stage. So you have X, Y, and Z that have to overlap in the intervals. you have A, B, and C that have to be outside those because you can't, A doesn't overlap Y and Z, B doesn't overlap X and Z, and so forth. And so there's basically no room for X in any kind of interval graph configure or interval assignment. If you look at another example, another classic non-interval graph is what's called C4 or the square or whatever, because if you go A, B, and C and get the overlaps necessary, then where do you put D? Because D doesn't overlap B, but it does overlap A and C. So there's no place to put it. And so those two that I just have given you, the one before with a triangle and what's called pendants, and C4 are forbidden subgraphs for interval graphs. And as any good graph theorist knows, what you want are forbidden subgraphs to characterize it. There are quite a few different alternative characterizations of interval graphs, but one of the classic ones is basically this is a forbidden subgraph, and the one I showed you with the triangle and the pendants is called an asteroidal triple, and that's a whole class of forbidden subgraphs then. Okay. So where does this go, and where does it tell me and tell you something about a career or something about doing mathematics? Well, one of the things that it says is that it takes hard work to do anything well, okay? And it takes hard work, and half the time, 3/4 of the time, 90% of the time, you don't have success in the way you thought you would have success. So the theme here is that you still have to do the hard work. I was intrigued, as I had already developed these slides, with the discussion of Kobe Bryant at 17, who went, right immediately out of high school into the NFL. And his high school coach, which is in Lower Merion, Pennsylvania, not far from me, said he was there at 5 o'clock in the morning every single day, so that he had to give him, which was probably, he shouldn't have ever said it, a key to get him into the gym. Can you imagine today even trying to give a key? If you gave a key to a person, probably would be fired on the spot. And the description of Kobe Bryant was he worked harder than any other basketball player or any other NBA player. So, but how do you work hard? Nothing teaches you in mathematics really how to work hard. Okay. So to begin with, if you've got a problem you want to solve, I want to know if every food web corresponds to an interval graph, competition graph. That was basically the problem I wanted to solve in my thesis. Okay. And as I said, I didn't solve it then. Nobody else did in the meantime either, though. So what do I wish I knew, and how can I come to know it? That's a challenge, because if you're at the beginning stages of solving a problem, you don't know what you need. So you have to just keep plugging away at trying things and talking to people. In particular, look to others for guidance and to help you articulate open problems that might not be the whole problem, but ultimately can be put together to create the answer to the whole problem. You don't need to solve problems by yourself. How often the image of mathematicians is a mathematician sequestered in their tiny office working on math problems. You've all seen it. You've seen it in actual fact, because there are mathematicians that work like that. And you've seen cartoons and stuff that show the mathematician, the geeky mathematician is always male, incidentally, in his office all by himself. But you don't have to. You get much further if you can talk about your problems, mathematical problems, even if the person who you're talking to doesn't know all of the material, doesn't know the background, because what they don't know, they will ask you, and you will be able to explain it, and in the process of explaining it, trigger things in your own mind. And as we will see later, helpers come from many unusual places. You never know where you're going to get the help you need to solve the problem. Okay, one of the key features of being a mathematician, of doing a dissertation, is to find open questions. Because the one thing in mathematics is you don't get a PhD unless you solve an open problem, a problem nobody else has solved. It's actually the only field where that's true. I always thought back when I was working on my thesis, I would love to be a biologist or a chemist where I could go into a lab, run experiments, and even if I hypothesized this was going to happen and it didn't, I changed the hypothesis to what happened. So you had something you could physically do. A lot of chemists and biologists argue with me a bit on that. But it doesn't carry the onus of solving a problem that no one else has solved, which is true, supposedly, among mathematicians. Now, once in a great while, a person solves a problem that everyone around them believes hasn't been solved, and somebody comes up with the fact that it actually was. And there's a famous story about Princeton University that way, in topology, where the guy presented his thesis and a person who will remain nameless stood up in the room and said, "But I solved that problem 20 years ago." The guy ended his thesis defense and never got a PhD. He could have, gone in slightly different directions. But in general, people know. So another point, when choosing your advisor for your PhD, first choose somebody nice, somebody who poses questions to you, somebody whom you can work with. But also, once you decide on where the kind of problem you want to work on, be sure that that person knows what's going on in the world in that area. I mean, Fred Roberts knew at the point that I was doing my thesis everything there was to know about food webs and competition graphs that had been discovered. Okay, so I was confident that what I would do would be different. And so there's all kinds of interesting pieces to that. So in posing open questions, you can pose big ones. Like, is the competition graph of a food web always an interval graph? That's a big question. That was the question I wanted to solve. Okay. But most of the time, you're not going to solve the big question, as I found out. But you can make inroads in it, or you can solve other problems that are sort of related to it. It may be why Fred had me doing mathematical psychology and computer science too. I don't know. But you don't have to solve the big problems. When I said my husband has the shortest thesis, he solved a big problem that everybody wanted the solution to, and he had an advisor who said, okay, 12 pages is sufficient. You got your degree. And a postdoc at Columbia, so you could tell how important that non-commutative ring theory problem was. Okay, if the answer is no, if you find a food web whose competition graph is not an interval graph, what do you do then? So are there conditions on a food web so that the competition graph is an interval graph? That's one option. Did you do something wrong? I mean, if something comes out opposite of what you thought it might, you always have to consider that you did something wrong and go back and go through it again. Sometimes actually get somebody else to do it and make sure. Okay. You brainstorm ideas. In this case, what are the characteristics of the community that you're working within? So wolves in Yellowstone is the community in the example I gave. What are the predator-prey relationships? In other words, we know wolves eat elk. Okay. We think they eat that deer mouse that ran across in front of them. Okay. But do you count that deer mouse as solely a prey of opportunity that wouldn't be normally a part of the diet? And you'll see that comes to play later on. And then what are the implications if you have graph theoretical theorems and considerations? Like, what are the implications of the forbidden subgraphs I showed you, like the square, the triangle with the pendants on it? Is there an implication in ecology to the construction of ever getting a competition graph like that? And particularly the square is the easiest one to look at. Okay. And does transitivity play a part? If A competes with B and B competes with C, does it mean that A has to compete with C? Okay. If that were true, then you couldn't get the square. Okay. Because you'd get the diagonal created by that. So, all right. So it takes it up to 1980. I finished my thesis. I take a job at Northeastern University. And I knew I wanted a place like Northeastern because Northeastern, and there are Northeastern people here, teaching was important. So I knew when I took a job, I wanted a job at a college or a university that valued teaching. Now, small schools do, but I like the big ideas, and big school like Northeastern. They truly did and still do value teaching. And so, okay, they also, because of the co-op program at Northeastern, always came up with interesting applied problems. People would come back from a co-op and say, Dr. Cozzens, you should be able to answer this question. And one example of that was, I was there probably, 3 or 4 years, and one of the math majors took a job at the hospital that had the severely handicapped cerebral palsy children. And they said, the biggest challenge with these children was communication. They basically only had vowel sounds, not consonants. And this particular math student said, can't you, and it was a graduate student actually who had decided to go on co-op even though they were a graduate student, isn't there a graph theoretic way of creating basically a network that will successively fill in the consonants so that you can create the words? Well, she and I, and it was a she, and Jack Deller in engineering, and Bob Tarjan at Princeton decided that, yes, it was possible to do it. And we created one of the first speech recognition algorithms. And unfortunately, we were stupid. We didn't patent it or anything else. And the huge speech recognition technology company to this day uses it for severely handicapped speech people. But that came about because of, in essence, a co-op. And those kinds of things cropped up all the time. So my two passions of solving hard problems or problems that were real and teaching was great at Northeastern. I mean, I still value that experience. I was there 12 years. And I still think Northeastern's one of the greatest institutions we have. So, but then, and this is to get you to think about, paths never are what you think they will be. A person at NSF came to me and said, we need you as a program officer at NSF. And Jim will know who it was. It was Shaka Shiri who said it. And I said, so what do you need me to do? And he said, I want you to do teacher enhancement, work with teachers and teach them what they needed to know. And I said, I don't want to do that because my experience, I had written a textbook for finite math, discrete math, whatever you want to call it. I felt comfortable in curriculum. I said, I'll come, but I've got to work with what was called IMB at the time, the curriculum unit. But I'm not going to do teacher enhancement. And so, of course, he kept saying, you got to, and I said, no, I don't got to do anything. And about a year later, Shaka Shiri was fired, and Luther Williams came in as head of EHR, the assistant director, they called it, was a much more powerful position. And Luther called me up and he said, okay, Midge, now you can come. And I said, why? And he said, number one, Shaka Shiri was gone, but number two, you can do whatever you want. And I said, I don't want to do teacher enhancement. Of course, I've done a lot of teacher enhancement since, and he said, you don't have to, you can come as a program officer in IMD. And at that point, they were doing full curriculum, elementary, middle, high school curriculum, textbooks and so forth for math in high school. So it was marvelous, but some of you here who are older know Joanne Leitzel. Joanne was the division director at the time. And come January, she says, I'm out of here. I'm going to the University of Nebraska as provost, which she did. So I came in July, and in January I became division director. I took Joanne's place and finished, my career at NSF as division director of EASY, elementary, secondary informal education, it was called at the time. And I loved it. So why did I leave? Because I went to Luther Williams and I said, Luther, the problem with K-12 education is not the K-12 schools, it's the colleges and the preparation of teachers. And he said, if you believe that, go to a school that has a big teacher education program. So that's how I ended up at the University of Colorado at Denver. So, but who would have ever thought that back in third grade or high school or Rochester or Rutgers when I got my PhD? But if it sounded interesting, I said, okay, you got to do that. And it does two things. It gives you a tremendous variety of things. Jim did that. He sort of stayed at Nebraska most of the time, but he did a lot of different things. It gives you a lot of interesting things to do, and if you're willing to move. I've lived in Boston. I've lived in Washington, D.C. area. I've lived in Denver. I've lived in really interesting places and done interesting things. So I'm skipping a piece till the next slide, but what am I doing now? I'm viewed as distinguished research professor, and as was said in the introduction, I'm also Associate Director for Education in DIMACS. What pays me is the Distinguished Research Professor, not the Associate Director position, but it means I'm still valued for doing research and teaching, the two things I love to do. Okay. Jeez. It's not clear why this thing only, whoops, now I went too far. All right, in between coming to Rutgers, which was done primarily because I needed to move back to the east and move my mother in with me, who was 92 at the time, but I was provost and vice chancellor at CU Denver. We have people here from Metro State who were probably there when I was at CU Denver, in fact, because we shared campuses. Always a challenge every year that it existed, and a community college besides. then I became president of the Colorado Institute of Technology, which was not a university. CIT, again, people think interesting thoughts. When Bill Owens became governor of Colorado, he said, why is it that academic institutions don't do what business and industry wants? And then academic institutions said back, well, because we do what we've always done forever. And it's still true today to a large extent, although some are doing much better than they were at that particular point in time. But they wanted somebody who would have that interface, who would do two things: have the interface between business and industry and academia, and raise money to support it, because the state put no money into it. And they started with a president who was John Buechner, who was University of Colorado system president, and he lasted probably a year in that job. And I thought he actually did a good job. He had difficulty dealing with some of the companies and the businesses that Governor Owens wanted to, and so they came to he had retired from CU anyway, and so he stepped down, and they hired John Hansen, who was a serial entrepreneur, young serial entrepreneur, who knew business and industry well. Well, John lasted a year because he hadn't a clue about academia and dealing with academia. So the governor called me one night and said, would I become president and CEO? He said, I think you can deal with both sides of that coin. And I raised $50 million a year for 5 years, each year. And I got people to do things. I gave the money away that I raised to the colleges and universities. Because the one axiom in universities is if you give them money, they'll do what you want, generally speaking. And they did. So, for example, transportation was critically important in Colorado for anybody who's lived there, or critically important here in Nebraska too, probably. And yet, none of the civil engineering programs at DU, which had one at the time, CU, Boulder, Denver, CSU, you name it. None of the civil engineering programs had even a course in transportation. So I gave them money. They developed a program in transportation. And to this day, the CU Denver one is actually the one that's touted as the best in the country in transportation. You know, they developed a whole program around it, but it took an encouragement, I'll say. And that occurred on a number of different situations where, and the colleges and universities weren't just the research ones. Regis University, you know, every college and university was viewed as eligible for any of the funding. Now, many of them didn't have degree programs in a particular fields, but it worked. But Bill Owens was term limited, and it was time to leave and time for me to retire. So I retired and thought I retired and moved to New Jersey to take care of my mother. And then Rutgers discovered I'd moved to New Jersey. And my advisor, Fred Roberts, was director of Dymax. And so he was smart. He said, okay, you can do this little bit and then that little bit. And I'm probably 75% time now. But most of it is funding that I get myself. So I will only go for grants that I want to do, which is a huge difference. And I'm sure anybody who retires loves that particular option. But again, I taught every year that I was vice chancellor. I taught every year that I was president of Colorado Institute of Technology. I taught the graduate game theory, which was a Boulder-Denver combined course, because I didn't want to give up teaching. Coming back to Rutgers and Dymax, I've taught every semester now the online calculus for business students for Rutgers Camden, but I also taught the history of math for probably 10 semesters. But there's a story in itself there, and I'm not going to go there at this point. So you can continue if you have a passion. You don't give up on your passion even though things turn you in different directions. Okay, let's come back. And how do we solve the food web problem? And probably every year or two, I thought to myself, oh, that problem's got to be solvable. And I would look, and of course, because I'd done work in the area, I would get papers to referee, and I would keep track of the literature. Nobody solved it. So I kept thinking about it. And in particular, I realized that one of the things I needed the most was some ecology people. So who do you turn to when you need help? My older daughter is a conservation biologist, and so she and I had many conversations about solving the problem. But she's the one that produced the wolves in Yellowstone food web for me, not herself, but she got it for me. Okay, and of course you had to see if anything was learned since the 60s and 70s. And then I had, as I have had many times, REU students in the summer of 2016. Now that's a particularly interesting time in my life because it wasn't Pratik and I got together in some sense cold without me having thought about it. But the previous 6 months I had gone through chemotherapy. And so when you do that, you usually can't do much else. And so I wrote a couple of papers and a chapter in a book on food webs. And I thought, okay, I'm back in my head in the problem again. So when Pratik came and we talked about the food web problem, he said, as only Pratik can say, we are going to solve that, Midge, period. He works for Google now. And I think anybody who got him is probably ecstatic for it. And so re-enter my daughter. She gets the food web that is not, if you do a direct translation to a competition graph, is not an interval graph. In fact, if you remember those two green things and the red thing, that's like the triangle with the, I can go back to it in a few minutes. And so Barbara became our expert in terms of the ecology and the background pieces of that. So the daughter that caused me in some sense to stop working on my PhD comes back to solve the problem I wanted to work on all along. Okay. And if I can make this thing work, I'll go back to those so you can see it. Just for a minute. Come on. Backwards. Now it wants to go without me. Okay, come on. Maybe I can go backwards. No, that was the food web, and the red edges become important, so just look at them for a minute. But if you look at the next one, you'll notice that there is a triangle of bighorn sheep, elk, and coyotes with pendant edges out to beaver, to deer mouse, and to wolf. So that means that competition graph is not an interval graph as it stands. Hopefully you're patient. Maybe this needs a new battery. Come on. I'm almost done, so don't. Okay, so Pratik and I talked about what are the possible options. Can we weight the edges of the competition graph in a certain way by the number of predators in common? And maybe that has something to do with the fact that that wolf food web didn't correspond to a comp. That didn't go anywhere. Still might, but it didn't go anywhere. Weight the arcs of the food web with a proportion of the diet consumed. In other words, wolves eat a lot of elk. They don't eat hardly any deer mice. They eat that deer mouse that ran across in front of them. It's not considered a viable prey. So Barber's suggestion was anything that is less than 20% of the food source for a creature, it shouldn't even be counted in the food web. You should talk about the food web as primary predator-prey relationships. And if indeed you do that, lo and behold, you get an interval graph for the wolves of. And indeed, we went back to the biologist in Yellowstone, and he created these amounts for us. We said, we need it. He said, well, you know, we don't stand there and watch how much they eat, but I've been in Yellowstone for something like 15 years. I will make an estimate on them. And by using his estimates, we were able to knock out some of them. And in particular, in that competition graph I showed you with the two green ones and the red one, we knocked out that red pendant, and it became an interval graph. But that's not sufficient, as any good mathematician knows. That's that red edge, because the deer mice weren't primary prey. But are we done? No, you need in mathematics to create a theorem, and then you need to prove it. So we created a theorem, and we proved it. Pratik used one of the characterizations of interval graphs of consecutive ones. I used the forbidden subgraph characterization, and we both proved it. So we were happy. Both of us came to the same conclusion. Okay. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and hopefully you've gotten some ideas. And in particular, hopefully, you see so many possibilities for yourselves. And you can go in so many different directions. If you want to be a high school teacher, be a high school teacher. And if something changes your mind down the road, go with it. Okay? And I love Carl Sagan's quote there. We make our world significant by the courage of our questions and the depths of our answers. And so we always have to be asking questions and looking for answers. I mean, I'm still amazed at this group that has gathered here and excited about the future. You have so many opportunities, so many chances to make us have a better world and to solve mathematical problems. So don't be deterred. If ever you feel like you're depressed, I can't go on, call me up, email me, and I'll be there for you. Okay? Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for listening to me.
We have time for maybe one or two questions for Dr. Cozzens. Does anyone have a question?
No questions?
Well, I had a question. So change is terrifying, whether it's changing your major or your career. And you changed a lot. Is it like a natural fearlessness that you had, or was it a struggle every time?
I would say part natural fearlessness, but also a struggle. I mean, I think both operate when you do those. You know, as I said, the governor called me at 10 o'clock at night. He says, Midge, this is Bill. I said, Bill? Who, Bill? He says, Bill Owens. And I said, yes, Governor. Now I've registered who you are on the phone. He says, I need you. And of course, that's part of me. Like Luther Williams said, I need you at NSF. If people say they need me, I tend to say yes. And so I said, let me think about it for 24. He says, I'll give you 24 hours. Now that was scary, particularly because part of it was I had to raise my own money. And I was not a fundraiser. But I learned. And I got along well with the business and industry. Quest gave me $10 million each year for 5 years. And Quest is a strange company, so Anschutz originally at Quest. So, I figure I'll give it my best, and if it doesn't work, I'll quit. And I was old enough so that I thought I could retire almost any time. But when you talk about people, and you see Barbara, my daughter, who's been Nature Conservancy, Greater Yellowstone, now she's executive director of the Cassisi Project, which is an NGO. She has that same fearlessness. But the difference is, in a way, she panics and calls me. And then I talk her down, and she goes on and does everything she needs to do. So you need either a fearlessness, or you need a person you can call who will talk you down at that point. My other daughter is extremely successful, does high-end tax accounting, trust and estate work. So she's the one that makes all the money in the family. And she's proud of that, let me tell you. But again, it's a certain amount of fearlessness. And she went to Northeastern and iterated what she needed to do what she's doing now, making a lot of money. So, again, we tend to try and determine what we need to do to be successful. But you've got to have people to talk to. That's the important part. Great,
thank you. So I just have a couple of announcements before we thank our speaker again. You should have breakout session tickets in the back of your name tag. If something has inspired you to change your mind, you can switch those tickets. And to do that, you would go to the conference registration desk and see what sessions have extra tickets, and you can exchange them. The other announcement is that if you're facilitating a breakout session, there will be a brief meeting at 5:25 in the director's boardroom. And so we will start the poster session at 3 o'clock, which is 7 minutes from now. We have a brief break, but let's first thank our speaker again.